Well, as the fighting continues there in Libya, there's been talk about whether or not the U.S. or other allies should step in. This as President Muammar Gaddafi warned millions will die if U.S. and NATO forces intervene. Joining us now with some thoughts on all this, Herb London, the president of the Hudson Institute and professor emeritus at New York University. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. You know, even though Gaddafi continues to deny that he's staging attacks against his own people, the violence, of course, as you saw from Steve's report, is escalating there. And this week, President Obama is saying he has ordered plans giving the U.S. military, quote, full capacity to act potentially rapidly if the situation there deteriorates. Do you think the time has come for a military option?
Well, I think that the military option certainly has to be considered. I mean, after all, you have a civil war in Libya with thousands of people whose lives are at risk. It seems to me that both NATO and the United States should seriously entertain the idea of doing something, whether it's the use of the Predator to take out some of those people who are leading this charge against the rebels, or whether, in fact, it is a direct control over the airspace in Libya is another matter. But it seems to me that something has to be done in order to quell these extraordinary circumstances that now exist in the country.
Well, lots of folks have been calling for the U.S. to direct no-fly zones for that region to send Gaddafi a message that we are backing the rebels and that Gaddafi has to go. Do you agree with that?
Well, part of the difficulty, of course, is the equivocation on the part of this administration. I think it's clear we ought to send a message that we are opposed to the Gaddafi forces, we're opposed to the use of force, we're opposed to what Gaddafi has done in taking out so many of the rebels. I think by and large what this government has to do is to start by taking a very, very clear and undeviating stance against Gaddafi. That is the beginning. And then, of course, trying to marshal support with NATO would be the second step.
But how important is it that the U.S. gets other allies on board with moving forward? Is this simply a fantasy at this point to think that other countries would help us? Why not call on the Arab League or other European nations to put the pressure on Gaddafi to go?
Well, I think that we should be putting the pressure on other nations to do that is another matter. As you know, the so-called allies of the United States have not always been cooperative. You may remember when Reagan sent airplanes into Libya to attack Libya, he could not get air rights over France. So there's no question that there may be difficulties. But I think that initiative ought to start. And not only should it start, but it seems to me that the United States ought to take the lead in providing that kind of initiative.
Well, how do you assess so far our response to the opposition forces in nations like Libya, Egypt, and other countries that are in the Middle East who are coming out by the thousands calling for reforms? Is this a pivotal moment in history for the U.S. to stand on the side of freedom?
Well, I think, excuse me for interrupting, I was going to say this is a moment not unlike 1979 or 1989, two revolutions that we've seen in the past. The 1979 revolution ousted an authoritarian government and created a theological government that is totalistic in its approach. The 1989 revolution changed the character of Eastern Europe, where in fact the totalistic government of communism was overthrown, and what you had was the emergence of a democratic infrastructure. We've got to see whether it's A or B, whether it's 1979 or 1989. And if we're going to provide any leadership so that this is a 1989 as opposed to a 1979 revolution, the United States has to take the lead in making it absolutely clear that the forces that are changing the character of the Middle East are forces consistent with the kind of democratic impulse that we would like to see.
Herb London, the stakes remain very high. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us with your insights.
Always a pleasure to be with you.